Fratelli Tutti. It sounds like a flavour of ice cream, but it is, of course, the first words and the title of Pope Francis's latest encyclical. That's Italian, and from St. Francis, who was a saint with a vivid sense of how we are brothers and sisters of a common Father. So they're the Pope's opening words, Fratelli Tutti. With these words, he says, St. Francis of Assisi addressed his brothers and sisters and proposed to them a way of life marked by the flavour of the gospel. Pope Francis has written 3 encyclicals, and this one is especially linked to its predecessor of 2015, Laudato Si. In a way, the two complement each other. Both are contributions to the social teaching of the Church. Both hope to reach everyone. Both begin with words from St. Francis. And while Laudato Si is a call to care for our common home and looks at our relationship with our planet and the environment, Fratelli Tutti is a call to tend to our human environment, our human relationships. Its theme is human fraternity and social friendship. Francis, says the Pope, felt himself a brother to the sun, the sea, and the wind, yet he knew that he was even closer to those of his own flesh. Wherever he went, he sowed seeds of peace and walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, and the outcast, the least of his brothers and sisters. So, it begins with a bang, and at the beginning, Brother Francis. And at the end of this long thing, I should have brought a copy, Blessed Charles de Foucauld. Interesting personality, less well known, but he was a French aristocrat and soldier and explorer who had a profound conversion to Christ and became a hermit in the Sahara, where he was murdered in 1916. And the paradox is that what drove his hermit life was a desire to be close in prayer, close in spirit, close in Christ, to everyone. And he used the phrase that he wanted to be a universal brother. You may have heard of the religious congregations of the Little Brothers and the Little Sisters of Jesus. They were inspired later by him. So the bookends of this encyclical are St. Francis and Blessed Charles. And so there's this stream of Catholic spirituality running through it. Now, the encyclical is also framed by the Pope's meeting in Abu Dhabi in 2019 with the Grand Imam, Ahmad al-Tayeb, and the statement that they co-signed, human fraternity for world peace and living together, a leading figure in the Muslim world and the Pope of the Christian world. And Pope Francis recalls how it was an extraordinary thing in the life of St. Francis that he set off for Egypt to meet the Sultan and to speak peace to him, really, and to try to make peace with him. And so the Pope and the Grand Imam met in the interests of peace last year. So it ties up well. And the great inspiration, of course, permeating the whole text, beginning, middle, and end, is the gospel. And this becomes especially clear in chapter 2, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which it expounds. So before we plunge into the encyclical, let's just stand back and ask, what is it? Well, it's an exhortation, it's a call, it's an appeal, it's a summons. In a world that's closed, divided in itself, and dark, where, to quote the Pope, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, he wants to, I'm quoting again, to contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity. He's issuing a protest against globalized indifference. Each person, each group, each country for itself, never mind the others. Now, COVID appeared while the Pope was working on the encyclical, and of course, he feels that only underlines the need for fraternity. We are all in one boat, as he famously said. So one might say that Fratelli Tutti has become now a sort of blueprint for a better, please God, post-COVID world. We need, says the Pope, to write together a new page of history, a page full of hope, peace and reconciliation, with, key point, everyone contributing. The Pope is fond of the metaphor of a dream. So, like Martin Luther King, who's mentioned, he has a dream, the Pope, and he wants us all to dream. Let us dream then, as a single human family, as fellow travellers, sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth. So, let's now look at the argument of the encyclical, or the Pope's thought, the way he develops it. In areas like this, the Pope doesn't do short, he doesn't do brief. The encyclical has 43,000 words. If you've ever tried to write 43,000 words, it's quite an undertaking. And 8 chapters and 280-something footnotes. Well, I just want to slip in something here. People of my generation, and as you realise, I'm not in my 20s, but people of my generation grew up during the Cold War, and the world at that time was scary, certainly, but it was also clearer, and it divided kind of two ways. It divided East-West. There was the Soviet bloc, the communist bloc, and the Western allies, and then it divided north-south, the rich and the poor. Well, now the world is still scary, but less clear, and the geometry of it is different. So we're not living in a bipolar world, as we were in those days, but in a multipolar world, with several different, often inscrutable players, or I sometimes think of tectonic plates moving under the earth. There's something going on, and you don't know when it's going to collide and cause an earthquake. Well, this is the world the Pope addresses. There's an image he's fond of here, both for society and for the world as a whole, continents, societies, nations, and so on. And it would be what would get a multipolar world, which is what we've got, like it or not, right. And it's the image of a polyhedron. And a polyhedron is a figure, a solid, with many faces or planes. But it is a whole. It holds together. It's rich in variety, but it's coherent. And I think that would be, he's often using this image in the church as well. And remember, he comes from Latin America, one of what we would consider the outposts of the polyhedron, as it were. Well, now, what's his dream? Well, actually, it begins as a nightmare, or with his phrase, shattered dreams. Chapter 1 is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, and it's a dark chapter. The Pope begins with what is undermining the development of human fraternity. Forms of integration in Europe and Latin America, for example, seem to be unraveling, with aggressive nationalism reasserting itself, or an economic and financial globalism imposing a single cultural model and only really interested in quick profits. Historical awareness is fading. We believe we can just start again from ground zero. There's no common vision, he says, just a battleground of conflicting interests. And he brings back, as an image is used all through his pontificate, brings back this notion of a throwaway world, where the unborn, the disabled, the elderly, and food, of course, are just often thrown away, junked. Human rights are unevenly acknowledged. The sense of equal human dignity seems not to prevail, for example, between men and women. He mentions slavery, starting again, resurgent slavery. There's a climate of fear. We build walls of all kinds, keeping ourselves apart and immured. We withdraw into our own worlds. If only, he says, in the wake of the pandemic and other disasters, we might rediscover once for all that we need one another, and that in this way our human family can experience a rebirth with all its faces, all its hands, and all its voices beyond the walls that we have erected. Unsurprisingly, he touches on migrants, but he comes back to that later. We can leave that. Then he moves to the illusion of communication, often created by the media, and mentions how social aggression has found unparalleled room for expansion through computers and mobile devices. Well, of course, it's not the fault of the computers and the mobile devices, it's the fault of the people who use them. And as he mentions, and sadly it's true, even in the Catholic world, there can be great uncharity around on the social media. So there's a deficit for him of the true communication that makes for fraternity. So that's chapter 1, pretty dark, really. And yet at the end of it all, he says, well, we must hope. There you go. So where does he go next to find hope? To the gospel and to the great parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 7. Through the dark clouds, he searches, he says, for a ray of light in a closed world, for an icon of openness. Against the background of the fratricide of Cain, he traces the biblical call to love the neighbour and the growing awareness of its extension to the stranger that we find in the Old Testament and the Jewish tradition. And then he turns to a very Ignatian, kind of Jesuit style contemplation of Jesus's parable, and he draws us into the different figures of the famous story. The robbers, the passers-by, the mugged man by the roadside, the good Samaritan. It's all really very topical. The stranger on the road has many modern incarnations, as do the other figures. And so he asks, well, who are we? Where am I in this? The Pope remarks that here and now, anyone who is neither a robber nor a passerby is either injured himself or bearing an injured person on his shoulders. So the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. Each day, he says, we have to decide. The Samaritan crossed boundaries to become a neighbour to the wounded man. And for Christians, he points out, there's an even deeper meaning to that outreach, because Christ himself is in each of our abandoned or excluded brothers and sisters. So there we are. So that's chapter 2. So having found a ray of light in the dark and an open heart, the heart of the Good Samaritan, in a closed world, The Pope, in the remaining chapters, that's 3 to 8, proposes a few lines of action, he says. Well, I'll give a brief summary first of these remaining, 6 chapters, and then go through them in a little more detail. But the Pope begins with love. This is chapter 3. Indeed, the love that draws from the grace of God and is called in the Christian tradition charity or agape. This is the driving force of human brotherhood. Then he turns, chapter 4, to the huge issue of migration. Chapter 5 proposes a better kind of politics and ways of bringing society together. Chapter 6. In chapter 7, he discusses how conflicts can be overcome and peace be established. And lastly, in chapter 8, the contribution of religion. So these are the hot spots, so to speak. Migration, politics, social life, building peace, and the role of religion. Well, these are familiar topics in Catholic social teaching, but the times are always changing, circumstances are changing. Here they are being addressed today, and in Pope Francis' own way, from his distinctive perspective. Now, our lives are small, and these big issues may seem remote at first sight, but really, if we think about it, they are part of our life. They all touch on our life. I mean, when we walk down the street, we realize there has been some migration. We're all concerned about politics. We're all wanting to bring society together and so on. So it's not all just up in the sky. It does test us. So there we are. So let's just follow it a little more closely, these chapters here. Now, he says we can only envisage and engender an open world. That's what he wants. The world is closed. He wants to open it up. We can only do that when we realize our human and Christian vocation to love, when we go beyond ourselves to others, relate to others, when we have real faces to love, he says. But this can't be restricted to our own family and friends, basic though that is. Love also impels us towards universal communion. It's not an abstract love, I love humanity. I don't actually love any particular person, I just love humanity. No, that's not what he's saying. It presupposes recognizing each and every person as having dignity, as having value. The word charity means holding dear, caros, cher, as we say in French, and promoting their true good. This is true charity, true love. It can be exercised by societies and doesn't just look on others as associates or colleagues. Its tendency is always towards real brotherhood. There's the famous trio from the French Revolution: liberty, equality, fraternity. He kind of changes the order and says, well, you don't really get true liberty, you don't get true equality without fraternity. So the good of persons is the true goal, the true moral good of people and societies. We have had enough, he says, of immorality and the mockery of ethics, goodness, faith, and honesty. He evokes the role of families in providing a good moral education for their children, and solidarity, of course. And he concludes the chapter by emphasizing the social role of property. In other words, if you've got stuff, share it. So, having rooted the whole enterprise of fraternity in love, the Pope turns to migrants. Now, we know there's one of his strong themes. They are dear to his heart, and as we know, it's a big and sensitive and burning topic. He was eager to make direct contact. You'll remember in 2013 he went to the Italian island of Lampedusa, where migrants were landing from North Africa. In 2016 with the Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, he went to the Greek island of Lesbos, and he has housed refugees in Rome. Complex challenges arise when our neighbour happens to be an immigrant, he says. Now, despite what is said about him sometimes, the Pope is not naive about all the social issues around migration, but he is emphatic on a heart open to the whole world and the need to welcome, protect, promote and integrate those who come from elsewhere. He speaks of their concrete needs and the need for thoughtful planning and a form of global governance. It can't just be done by each nation individually. This is a problem that embraces us all. I shouldn't have said problem, he wouldn't agree with that. So we should think in terms of reciprocal gift. The people who come, we hope, gain something from those to whom they come, and those who receive them are also enriched. And he concludes, it's quite interesting, I won't dwell on it, but this chapter 4 with a discussion on how we are kind of local creatures. We belong to a place, we belong to a people, a country, and so on, and universal. And how do you get the balance? Well, he says, really, we need both. We need both in our lives. So next, naturally, politics. Well, this is where, people do become vocal. Can't be founded, he said, on a narrow-minded populism, which debases the real worth of a people, nor at the service of a liberal economic system which favours the few and looks to market forces for salvation. He calls for a reform of the United Nations. A better politics should serve the common good, integrate the vulnerable, make the creation of work a priority, favour productive diversity and business creativity, and guarantee authentic human rights. And the Pope is out to retrieve the idea that actually being a politician is something noble. It's a fine vocation. We are famously cynical about politicians. You know the story about, how can you tell if a politician is lying? Now, but he points out an individual can help someone cross a river. They put them in their own little boat and row them over. But a politician can build a bridge. That helps many more people. So he talks of political love. I don't know how that would go down, but maybe more politicians would respond to that than you think. It must be at the heart. It's not a matter of votes and successes, but sowing the seeds of social well-being. Then he moves on from politics to society as a whole. And he's got this concept, social friendship. Well, how on earth do we get to that? How can our societies establish an all-embracing social covenant among their members? Well, he says, first of all, talk to each other. Talk to each other and listen to each other. Issues must be addressed. He advocates being interdisciplinary, not just taking one perspective on a social issue, but calling in the different people, calling in, the social workers, calling in the scientists, this problem arises with COVID and its impact. It's many faceted. And we don't just want the politicians to tell us what to do. We don't just want the scientists, but we want the whole chorus, really. In pluralist societies, this is a very serious question, really. How can we achieve the consensus we need to hold together? and not just be a collection of juxtaposed interests, each with our own background, our own beliefs, our own religion, and so on and so on. Well, the Pope is strong here on the need for truth. He doesn't believe in relativism. I've got my truth, you've got your truth, and there it is. No, we must search together for true values and build society and a new culture on them. And then he ends this chapter. Often I noticed going through this, he'll do a sudden twist at the end of a chapter. Maybe you're thinking, oh gosh, getting a bit tired. And then he'll suddenly say something a little bit different. And so he ends the chapter, again, as I say, with an unexpected twist. And he says, be kind. Kindness, social kindness, just kindness in courteousness, courtesy in our daily relationships, in the places that we live. Kindness, it creates a culture. Okay, now relationships famously break down all over the place. Macro relationships and micro relationships. And chapter 7 says, well, how do we come together again? How do we encounter, that's one of his favourite words, how do we encounter one another yet again? So he says we need an architecture of peace. I think he's meaning we need institutions that, governments obviously, but other institutions that work for peace. But we also need an interpersonal architecture and art. What do we need? Well, he says the obvious things, but they're always worth saying. That truth is essential, and justice, and a will to reconcile. And he goes in some depth into forgiveness, and especially into what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean tolerating oppression. It doesn't mean I deny that anything dreadful happened. It doesn't mean just forgetting the wrong done. It doesn't mean letting criminals or oppressors go unpunished. No, it looks at the reality, it looks at what happened, but it tries not to get stuck there. It doesn't respond by vengeance. So that's we have to move beyond. Address the anger, address the hurt, address the wounds. There are so many spheres, as we know, where this is true, big and small. But then not get locked in, not get locked down, but go together for a better future. Well, again, there's a surprise at the end of this chapter 7, and it's, it got into the newspapers, as it were. He develops the church's teaching, especially in St. John Paul II. It was already getting up steam there about the death penalty and war, including the use or threat of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. In the modern world, we can no longer, he says, think of war as a solution, because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. It is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. There are 4 conditions, aren't there, for a just war, but he said it's becoming more and more difficult, given what war is, given its consequences and all of that. It's very difficult to conceive now of a just war. And so the total elimination of nuclear weapons and of the other horrors as well must be our goal. Likewise, he says, the use of the death penalty makes no sense in a world where it's possible to keep society safe without it. Okay, we're nearly there. Chapter 8. Against the claim of some who see religion as the source of conflict in the world, The Pope argues that the great world religions have much to offer towards fraternity. Terrorism can invoke texts and traditions sometimes, but in the Pope's mind, these are distortions. What religions provide are the truest, most solid foundations of human brotherhood, namely a sense of the fatherhood of God, of conscience, personal conscience, and the transcendent worth of the human being. The Church, for her part, with her long experience of sin and grace, has something to give here. She has a legitimate public role and the treasure of the gospel of Jesus Christ. She is present in many places, and, he says, in the power of the risen Lord, she wants to give birth to a new world where all of us are brothers and sisters, where there is room for all those whom our societies discard, where justice and peace are resplendent. Well, that's his dream. And then just some little bits and pieces at the end, and two final prayers. One to the Creator, which he would hope could be shared beyond Christianity, and one to the Trinity. So there it is. I should be waving it at you. It's large, it's unwieldy, but it's full of good meat. You can purchase it from the CTS, you can download it from the Vatican website and elsewhere. It perhaps wouldn't be something you'd necessarily, sit in your deck chair on if we had a sunny afternoon to read. But perhaps one way to focus on it, even in a parish, would be to first of all look at the chapter on the Good Samaritan. There's always new things to discover in that story, and then whatever your particular interests are, to choose one or other chapter, be it migrants, be it politics, be it peace building, or whatever. Now, of course, the nagging question is, well, what can I do about all this, or what can we do towards a more fraternal world and a friendlier society? We'd all agree very much with the Pope. That's what we all want. And yes, it's a great enterprise, and there are opportunities to hand in our work and our homilies. Our work and our families. So, and the church does a lot in this way, and even here, we have our SCIAF, we have Justice and Peace, we have the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. They're all in different ways. They're working in that direction, so we can be part of that. But I'd like to end with something the Pope only touches on. If he'd rung me up while he was writing the encyclical and said, Hugh, can you think of something? Can you something to add? I might have said, well, Holy Father, there's just one wee thing you miss. He just mentions it in passing. And he says this, he said, the Good Samaritan couldn't do everything on his own. So he took the stranger to a hostel and entrusted him to an innkeeper and left him money. I seem to remember on that road, which is still there, of course, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho to Jerusalem, goes down, 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 down. And halfway along it, I remember there's a pub which I think it's called the Good Samaritan or something, claims to be the original place. But I think that hostel is a very important symbol. We could say it represents a community. It represents the macro community of the church, because there Christ, who is the Good Samaritan, he takes us to be healed and put back on our feet so that we can go on. But maybe in this quest for fraternity, we can think any wholesome micro-community, our family, a parish, a Christian group of any kind can be an open place, and not a dark place, but a light place, where we can discover and share fraternity and friendship. So we might think of that. Just, could we make our homes? Can we make our parishes this kind of hostel where those who, and it's most of us in some way or other, those who have been beaten up by life, can find shelter and a new start, and all of us start to rebuild a saner and healthier world.